بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. This lecture is about the anatomy of the orbital autonomic nervous system. We are going to discuss the autonomic nerve supply to the orbit and to the globe. First of all, we are going to give an introduction about the anatomy of the nervous system. Nervous system is divided anatomically into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is that part of the nervous system that is protected by bone. I mean that the brain is protected by the skull and the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. And the central nervous system is characterized by being covered by three coverings or meninges: pia mater, arachnoid, and dura mater. The function of the central nervous system that it receives different sensations, then associates, integrates, and elaborates them, then selects the motor neuron, which can send these motor orders to the proper effector so a proper function is obtained. The peripheral nervous system is composed of nerves and nerve endings, nerve ganglia. The nerves are either sensory motor or mixed nerves. The nerve endings are either sensory, which are called the receptors, and motor, which are called the effectors, and the nerve ganglia. By ganglion meaning that there is a collection of nerve cells but outside the central nervous system. On the other hand, we can say nucleus. Nucleus is a collection of nerve cells inside the central nervous system. The nerve ganglia are part of the peripheral nervous system. They are either sensory or motor, and the motor ganglia are autonomic, either sympathetic or parasympathetic. And the main function, it receives sensation and send orders. So the main function of the nervous system to receive the sensations through the sensory nerve fibers, then associates, integrates, and elaborates orders to a certain motor nerve fiber, then reaching the muscle or the gland. The nervous system can be also divided according to function into a somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Somatic nervous system is that part that control the organs under voluntary control, mainly muscles. And the autonomic nervous system is that part of the nervous system that regulate individual organ functions and homeostasis, and for the most part is not subjected to voluntary control. It is called autonomic, automatic, or visceral system. We are concerned with the autonomic nervous system. So, more details. The autonomic nervous system is a functional division of the nervous system in general, but anatomically it is distributed throughout the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. It controls the heart rate, force of contraction, dilatation and constriction of the blood vessels, contraction and relaxation of smooth muscles in various organs, and an important function is the visual accommodation, size of the pupil, as well as secretions from the exocrine and endocrine glands. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two separate divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And this classification or division is based upon anatomical as well as functional factors. But both of these systems consist of myelinated preganglionic fibers that shoot synapse into a ganglion, then unmyelinated postganglionic fibers, which reach the effector organ. These synapses occur in clusters of cells outside the nervous system, which are called ganglia. And most organs are innervated by fibers from both divisions, and usually the influence is opposing each other. There are certain characters that are specific to the sympathetic and others for the parasympathetic nervous system. So, the sympathetic nervous system is known to be the system of defense against any harm, any stresses to the body. So, its effect is usually generalized. It supplies the arterioles, the sweat glands, the muscles of the hairs of the skin, blood vessels of the limbs, and deep viscera. The sympathetic ganglia are either in the sympathetic chain or collateral ganglion around the large arteries. The preganglionic fibers are usually short, the postganglionic fibers are usually long. Parasympathetic nervous system, on contrast to the sympathetic nervous system, it aims at conserving and restoring energy at rest. So its effect is usually localized. It supplies only deep viscera, and the ganglion of the ganglia related to the parasympathetic nervous system are either in or on the wall of the organ, and they are called terminal ganglia. And according to this fact, we can say that the preganglionic fibers are so long and the postganglionic fibers are short. So here we have, if there is this is an organ, and as we have said before, that usually the organ receive the both nerve supply from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. What is characteristic uh, picture of the sympathetic nervous system that it have a very short preganglionic and long postganglionic fibers. On the other hand, the parasympathetic had a very long preganglionic fibers and very short postganglionic fibers. The origin of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system arises from the thoracic and lumbar segments of the spinal cord, while the parasympathetic fibers arises from the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 and the sacral part. So the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 is called the cranial part of the parasympathetic nervous system, and the thoracolumbar sympathetic fibers consist of the fibers that arise from all the thoracic segments and upper two lumbar segments, while the sacral parts of the spinal cord give rise to parasympathetic fibers, and it consists of fibers that arise from sacral segments 2, 3, and 4. So we can say that the sympathetic flow is a thoracolumbar outflow and the parasympathetic is a craniosacral outflow. And here we can say that the cervical part of the spinal cord, in addition to the lower lumbar segments of the spinal cord, are not related to the autonomic nerve. So here we have the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Of course, we are concerned more with the third and seventh cranial nerves as regard our subject, which is autonomic nervous system supplying the orbit and the globe. And we are, of course, the sacral part is not related to the supply of orbit and globe, and the sympathetic fibers arise from all the thoracic segments and upper two lumbar segments. Here's the spinal cord, and just parallel to it is the sympathetic chain, which is a collection of sympathetic ganglia, and fibers arises to reach the different organs. And here is the sympathetic autonomic fibers arising from the thoracolumbar segments, and the green color denoting the parasympathetic fibers arising from the cranial nerves as well as the sacral segment. So the sympathetic nervous system, which is called the thoracolumbar outflow, the cell bodies of the preganglionic fibers lie in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, leaving the spinal cord as a spinal nerve, and then a spinal nerve beginning as what's called a white ramus, joining the sympathetic chain, And then each ganglion in the sympathetic chain is connected to one or more of the spinal nerves but by what's called the gray rami. And the preganglionic fibers either relay in the chain or at a higher or at the chain at the same level or higher or lower levels or do not synapse at all to synapse at uh, other ganglion around the greater arteries and so on. The preganglionic fibers from the upper thoracic segments run upwards in the sympathetic chain to synapse with the three cervical sympathetic ganglia, and we are concerned mainly with the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion because it gives fibers uh, to the orbit, globe and orbit. The superior cervical sympathetic ganglion uh, nerves arising from carrying these sympathetic fibers form plexuses around the internal and external carotid arteries. So here is the spinal segment with white ramus, then the sympathetic ganglion, then the gray rami. As regards the sympathetic supply to the eye and the orbit, we have number one, sympathetic supply to the dilator pupillae muscle. We have also sympathetic supply to the unstriated superior palpebral muscle or molar muscle, which lies under cover of the levator muscle. And also we have sympathetic supply to the lacrimal glands. First of all, sympathetic supply to the dilator pupillae muscle arises from fibers arising from the thoracic segments, then uh, was to the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion in the sympathetic chain. Both ganglionic fibers run upwards with the sympathetic plexus around the internal carotid artery. Fibers then pass through the nasociliary nerve, nasociliary of ophthalmic or trigeminal, entering the eye through the long ciliary nerves and reach the dilator muscle. Sympathetic supply to the unstriated superior palpebral muscle. These fibers again arises from the internal carotid artery plexus, but joining the oculomotor nerve and passing directly to the molar muscle or the superior palpebral muscle. Sympathetic supply to the lacrimal gland will be discussed with the parasympathetic supply of the lacrimal glands. So here we have the sympathetic fibers arising from the spinal segments, but also the fibers coming from higher centers in diencephalon and hypothalamus, then passing through the lateral horn of the spinal cord, and then the fibers rises and reaching the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion, from which fibers arises to join the internal carotid artery plexus, from which nerves passes through the dilator pupillae muscle as well as the unstriated uh, palpebral superior palpebral muscle. We have a well-known syndrome which is termed Horner's syndrome. Horner's syndrome is a syndrome characterized by injury to the cervical sympathetic fibers, and it will lead to four cardinal signs, which is ptosis, meiosis, anhidrosis, and enophthalmos. On the other hand, if there is a type of irritation or stimulation of the cervical sympathetic ganglion in cases of pressure by an aneurysmal dilatation or tumors or apical TB, just the opposite of such signs will occur. So we have widening of the palpebral fissure, pupillary dilatation, flushing and sweating with exophthalmos. So, parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic outflow of the parasympathetic nervous system arises from the cell bodies of the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 in the brainstem and from the sacral segments, and this is what is called craniosacral outflow. The ganglionic fibers run almost to the organ which is innervated and synapse in a ganglion which is very close or even within the wall of this organ, giving rise to a very short postganglionic fibers innervating the organ. Cranial nerves 3 and 7 affect the pupil and the accommodative and muscles of accommodation, ciliary muscles, which are concerned with chemical transmitter at both pre and postganglionic synapses is the acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. Also, the sympathetic preganglionic synapses and some sympathetic postganglionic synapses and the neuromuscular junction and some other sides of the central nervous system. Nerve fibers that release acetylcholine from their endings are described as cholinergic fibers. The cranial part of the parasympathetic system, we are concerned with the third and the seventh cranial nerve. The third cranial nerve or oculomotor nerve that arises from the midbrain of the brainstem, and the third nerve has a main nucleus and an accessory nucleus which is called Edinger vestibular nucleus. Edinger vestibular nucleus is the nucleus that is responsible to carry or give rise to the parasympathetic fiber. Again, the facial nerve, there is what's called a superior salivatory nucleus, and then passing to the sphenopalatine ganglion to give the lacrimal gland. Any parasympathetic ganglion. There are three types of fibers passing through any parasympathetic ganglion. These fibers are sensory fibers passing to the central nervous system and parasympathetic fibers which relay inside this ganglion and then rising postganglionic fibers supplying different muscles or glands. And also there is a sympathetic fibers which are postganglionic sympathetic fibers, and these fibers are passing without relay. We have two important ganglia which I have discussed. Is first of all is the ciliary ganglion and the sphenopalatine ganglion. The ciliary ganglion is located within the bony orbit, situated anterior to the superior orbital fissure between lateral rectus muscle and the optic nerve. Preganglionic fibers. The ciliary ganglion is supplied from fibers from Edinger vestibular nucleus associated with the motor nerve. This is the ciliary ganglion, and three types of fibers pass through the ciliary ganglion. The postganglionic fibers leave the ganglion through the short ciliary nerves, and these fibers continue into the orbit to innervate the structures of the eye. The postganglionic fibers from the ciliary ganglion innervate the sphincter pupillary muscle, which is responsible for pupillary constriction, and the ciliary muscles, which are responsible for accommodation and near vision. In addition, two sets of nerve fibers pass through the ciliary ganglion without relay. Sympathetic fibers from the internal carotid artery plexus innervating the dilator pupillae muscle, and also there are sensory fibers coming from the nasociliary nerve of ophthalmic of trigeminal innervating the cornea, ciliary body, and the eye. Here is the ciliary ganglion with its pre and post ganglionic fibers. So the ciliary ganglion is a parasympathetic ganglion situated, as we have said before, in the posterior near to the orbital apex. It measures 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter, and it contains about 2,500 neurons. Preganglionic fibers coming from Edinger vestibular nucleus, which is an accessory nucleus of the third cranial nerve, then passing with relay in the ciliary ganglion, then coming out as a postganglionic fibers attaching with the passing with the short ciliary nerves and innervating the sphincter pupillary muscle and the ciliary. So this is the ciliary ganglion, parasympathetic root coming from Edinger vestibular nucleus of the third cranial nerve. Sensory root is from the nasociliary, and the sympathetic root through the nasociliary ophthalmic of trigeminal coming from the internal carotid. So the oculomotor nerve is the third cranial nerve supplying all the extraocular muscles except the superior oblique and lateral rectus muscle. The third cranial nerve arising from the midbrain of the brainstem and then passing laterally to the posterior clinoid process, traversing its lateral wall of the cavernous sinus and dividing into the superior and inferior divisions which pass through the superior orbital fissure within the common tendinous ring. The oculomotor nerve supplying the levator muscle, superior rectus, by the superior division, and medial rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique by its inferior division. Here is the tendinous ring and the superior and inferior parts of the oculomotor. So the parasympathetic part of the oculomotor nerve arising from Edinger vestibular accessory nucleus of the third cranial nerve in the midbrain. Preganglionic fibers passing with the inferior division of the oculomotor nerve. Then passing with the branch to the inferior oblique muscle. This nerve entering the ciliary ganglion and will relay within this ganglion, and both ganglionic fibers carrying parasympathetic nerve fibers passing away from the ganglion to the eyeball through the short ciliary nerves, innervating the sphincter pupillary muscle and the ciliary muscles. The short ciliary nerves pierced the sclera around the optic nerve and passing forward into the subchoroidal space to reach the ciliary body and the iris. So, Edinger vestibular nucleus, oculomotor uh, nerve inferior division, nerve to inferior oblique passing through the ciliary ganglion, coming away from the ciliary ganglion as short ciliary to the sphincter pupillary and ciliary muscles. Here is the ciliary ganglion. The light reflex and the near reflex are also related to the fibers, pass through the ciliary ganglion, but the fibers responsible for the light reflex will relay into the Edinger vestibular. Also, the accommodation reflex is related to the parasympathetic fibers also in the Gisserian. We are going to give some hints about the anatomy of the facial nerve. The facial nerve and the nervous intermediates together forming the mixed nerve containing both sensory, motor, and parasympathetic fibers. The course of the facial nerve can be divided into three parts. The part from the brain to the internal auditory meatus, interpetrous part beginning at the internal auditory meatus and end at the stylomastoid foramen. And this is an important part because it gives rise to an important branch which is called the greater superficial petrous branch. And then the part that coming out from the stylomastoid foramen. This is the part that is arising from the pons and entering the internal auditory meatus. The autonomic or parasympathetic part of the facial nerve, coming from the superior salivatory nucleus. This nucleus is present in the reticular formation of the pons and join the other fibers of the facial nerve. Then, the parasympathetic fibers are carried in the greater superficial petrosal nerve, which will leave the internal auditory meatus through the hiatus of the greater petrosal nerve, which is found on the anterior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone in the middle cranial fossa. The greater superficial petrosal nerve passing forwards across the foramen lacerum, where it is joined with the deep petrosal nerve carrying sympathetic fibers from the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion together these two nerves enter the pterygoid canal as they are termed the vagus nerve or the nerve to pterygoid canal. The greater superficial petrosal nerve exits the canal with the deep petrosal. Then they will enter into the pterygopalatine ganglion and the pterygopalatine fossa. Parasympathetic fibers will relay inside the ganglion and the sympathetic fibers will pass without relay. Then the ganglia will give rise to nerve branches that will supply the lacrimal gland and the mucus secreting glands in the nasal and oral cavities. Here is a pathway of the facial nerve. We are concerned with the greater superficial petrosal branch, which will join the deep petrosal nerve. The pterygopalatine ganglion of Meckel is the largest parasympathetic ganglion associated with branches of the maxillary nerve, is deeply placed in the pterygopalatine fossa close to the sphenopalatine foramen, and it communicates anteriorly with the nasopalatine nerve. Here is the greater superficial petrosal nerve or large superior petrosal nerve joining the deep petrosal carrying sympathetic fibers. Both of them form the nerve to the pterygoid canal or vagus nerve. Then this nerve enter into the sphenopalatine ganglion, in which the parasympathetic fibers will relay. So the superior salivatory nucleus will give this greater superficial petrosal sphenopalatine ganglion, then will supply the lacrimal gland. So the lacrimal gland now will be supplied by both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. Parasympathetic nerve supply to the lacrimal gland coming from the superior salivatory nucleus of the facial nerve of the pons, just distal to the geniculate ganglion. The facial nerve gives off the greater superficial petrosal nerve. This nerve carrying parasympathetic secretory motor fibers through the pterygoid canal to the pterygopalatine ganglia. Here, the fibers, synapse, and both ganglionic fibers join the fibers of the maxillary nerve, which travels through the inferior orbital fissure. Once it traverses this opening, the parasympathetic secretory motor fibers branch off with the zygomatic nerve and then branch off again, joining the lacrimal branch of ophthalmic of trigeminal, which innervate the lacrimal gland. So this is the parasympathetic supply of the lacrimal gland. On the other hand, if we want to know what is the origin of the sympathetic postganglionic fibers reaching the lacrimal gland, they are the fibers coming from the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion. They travel as a periarteriolar plexus with the middle meningeal artery before they merge and form the deep petrosal nerve. Deep petrosal nerve joining the greater petrosal nerve in the pterygoid canal, and both of them form the nerve to the pterygoid canal or what's called vagus nerve, reaching the pterygopalatine ganglion and the pterygopalatine fossa. In contrast to their parasympathetic counterpart, sympathetic fibers do not synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglion, having done so already in the sympathetic chain. However, they continue to course with the parasympathetic fibers innervating the lacrimal gland through the maxillary nerve, inferior orbital fissure, zygomatic, and then the lacrimal nerve reaching the lacrimal gland. And here is the lacrimal nerve, branch of ophthalmic of trigeminal that is supplying the lacrimal gland. Thank you.